of all, let me say to the committee and to Martha up here like this. Is that better? Thank you for giving me a few minutes to speak with you all. I wanted to say something about my career because it was initiated by my education that I got here in Pataskala High School. May seem strange to some of you, but my career has been quite different than I expect most of you. I started out wanting to be an engineer. Was my goal when I was in high school, and it was kind of fostered by some of the things that I studied, and I wanted to give some recognition to some of the teachers that inspired me, like Virgil Mauger, who taught mathematics, and I learned an awful lot from him, and it stuck with me. And I think it speaks well of all the education that I got here. Things like English class with Dorothy Angevine, for example. Now, when I took English there, I couldn't figure out how in the world I would ever use any of this stuff. But later in my career, I had to write some papers and journal articles and things like that they were highly technical, but I still had to know how to put sentences together and use correct grammar and all this sort of thing. So I was always grateful that even though I didn't understand why I needed to learn it back in high school, it kind of stuck with me and it made things easier for me the rest of my career. So I would like to give kudos to all those teachers, like Ellen Nichols, who inspired me to study harder on chemistry and science that she taught. And as it turns out, I needed that because I had to put together these papers they were highly scientific articles that I was writing, and I had to know what the chemistry terms meant and all that sort of thing, which I started with the high school stuff and of course continued into college. Then later on, when I left college, I went to work for a company called General Electric, which many of you are familiar with. And at the plant in Cincinnati, they were trying to build, believe it or not, an airplane engine which was powered by atomic energy. This was initiated back in the early 1960s when we were in a Cold War with Russia, well, actually the Soviet Union at that time. And we had to keep airplanes in the air continually loaded with atomic weapons in case Russia sent their ICBMs over. We had airplanes in the air, and many of you may remember the refueling operations that went on around central Ohio. Anyway, we had to have those airplanes ready to send immediately for retaliation. Well, Kennedy was president at that time, and he and his defense secretary, Robert McNamara, they thought, well, gee, if we had an atomic engine in one of these airplanes, we could stay up there indefinitely. We wouldn't have to do all this refueling. Just be limited by the endurance of the flight crew. So they gave General Electric this contract to study and research atomic energy for use in an airplane. Well, GE had a lot of experience building turbojets, which are fueled by aviation fuel and air. So they thought, well, what if we just put instead of the combustion chamber in the turbojet, we'll put an atomic reactor in there. Well, as you might imagine, that creates a lot of problems. And the 2 years that I worked there, we worked on a lot of problems. The group that I was with was tasked to investigate the shielding because there's radiation comes from atomic reactions, and the crew has to be shielded. So the first job I had there right out of school was to design cooling systems for that shielding. And boy, did I have to learn a lot about fluid mechanics and thermodynamics and heat transfer and all this stuff. Well, it was all for naught because not my learning, but the research on the engine was destined to fail because it turns out that you can't carry that much weight. You can't generate enough power unless, and this was kind of a standard joke after the thing was canceled, that went around the offices there in Cincinnati and said, well, the only way this airplane's ever going to fly is like 10,000 feet below sea level, which is ridiculous, you know? And that would be in order to get enough density in the air to generate the power necessary. So it was scrapped. Well, there I was, moved my family to Cincinnati, and no job. Well, I shouldn't say that. They didn't just cut us off, but we had time to phase out. So the phase out consisted of GE bringing in other entities within their organization to see if they wanted to pick up any of these brilliant engineers that were working on this atomic energy project. So I got an offer from one of the groups over in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. They were doing turbine engines for powering helicopters. Well, I thought about that for a while, and then I thought, well, gee, I remember this picture in history books showing George Washington and his crew wintering in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, and I said, man, I don't want any part of this. You know, standing knee-deep in snow and no shoes or anything. Well, I probably would have shoes, but anyway, I didn't want to go there. So the next thing that was offered through GE was to let other companies come in and interview the engineers and see if any of them wanted to pick us up. So fortunately for me, there was a group called Chrysler Corporation Space Division, which had just begun to set up their operations in Huntsville, Alabama, to support the newly generated, newly organized NASA. Now, some of you may not know where NASA came from, so I thought I might just elaborate a little bit on that. Turns out that before NASA was organized, there was a group that studied aeronautics throughout the country. They were called NACA. That stands for the National Committee for Aeronautics and Astronautics. So that was the forerunner of NASA. And about that same time, many of you remember this, that Werner von Braun and his crew from Germany were brought over to the United States after the Second World War. And they were headquartered in Texas. Well, when Kennedy and McNamara and the administration that was running things then, they said, well, we ought to conglomerate all this stuff into one group. So they brought in things, the other organizations like the Ames Research Center in California, see if I can remember all of them, the Lewis Research Center here in Ohio in Cleveland, Goddard Rocket Center there in Maryland, and of course Kennedy Space Center in Florida, and the Johnson Center in Houston. So anyway, that all came together and they formed it and they called it NASA, NASA, which is National Aeronautics and Space Administration, which we know of today. So when I interviewed with that, they told me what they were trying to do in Huntsville, and it was to develop these huge rockets, which eventually would be able to take us to the moon. And man, my mind just started reeling from all this. You know, man, we're going to take this project and make it into a booster that would take us to the moon. And that was just amazing to me. And I thought, man, that's something I want to work on. So they made me an offer, and I accepted. So we packed up, my family and I, and we moved to Huntsville, Alabama. Well, the project that I was assigned to was to use my expertise that I had gained working in this field of heat transfer and thermodynamics and all that with the aircraft nuclear propulsion and put it to work on this booster. The problems that we addressed there were the base heating, which comes from these huge engines blasting out 2,000-degree gases and the radiation coming up against the vehicle. So it had to be protected with some kind of materials. So we had to understand what that gas was, how it produced the thermal effects that we had to protect against. So that led us to, when I say us, there was a team of us that worked on most of these things. I didn't do any of it individually, except for in a few instances. But anyway, so we developed computer codes to analyze and estimate what these effects looked like. And then the other engineers who were developing materials, they could take that input, find out what material thickness was and how much they needed to put on. So anyway, I worked on that for a few years, and that all led to being involved in the development of some very highly sophisticated computer technology, computer codes, which we wrote describing these things like the gas flows, the chemistry effects, and everything. So that came to be known as computational fluid dynamics, a term some of you may have heard. I don't know, it's bantered around a good bit. It's called CFD. And during the period of time when we were doing this work, our upper management encouraged us to write technical articles and engineering papers and scientific papers and journal articles and so on, describing what we were doing, because it was state of the art. We were advancing the technology by doing these things. So anyway, over those years, I did develop quite a few techniques which were recognized throughout NASA. And I got one article here that I can pass this around, let you all look at it if you'd like to. But it's an award that I got that says Certificate of Recognition. Now, this is for some work that I did on those massive rocket exhaust plumes that carried those rockets up in the atmosphere and then onto the moon. So it was very significant, and I was proud of getting that. They even gave me some money with it, which I was surprised at. But anyway, it was very nice that I did. Somebody might want to look at that if you want to pass it around. So anyway, another very important project that I worked on, which I'm very proud to talk about, was the Space Shuttle main engine. In the early 1980s, NASA developed switched from the main large boosters, which were lost, dumped back in the ocean, to using a reusable vehicle called the Space Shuttle, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. It was around for many, many years. They've all been retired now, but at any rate, just a couple of things about that main engine. I could talk about the extremely high pressures and high temperatures and all that kind of thing, and the fact that it goes, the propellants go from like minus 460 degrees Fahrenheit up to like 6,000 degrees at a pressure of 3,000 psi. Now that probably doesn't mean a whole lot to some of you, but I read an article recently where somebody put that sort of in layman's terms, and they said, well, consider this. If the engines all three engines are operating at full power during liftoff, they're generating the same amount of power as 23 Hoover dams. If you've ever been to Hoover Dam, they've got that huge body of water behind it with all that potential energy, and they're spinning these turbines, generating all that power that supplies electricity to like Las Vegas and other California cities. But those engines put out 23 times as much power as the Hoover dams. So it's just amazing. Another layman's idea is if you consider a large swimming pool, like say 40 by 20, typical size pool. If these 3 pumps are running at full power, again, supplying the gases to the injector to blast out the back end, they could drain a pool, a swimming pool, in 25 seconds, just like that, and the water would be gone. So it's quite an amazing engine. Anyway, when it was first designed by Rocketdyne in the late 70s and early 80s, they sort of did it by what engineers call seat of the pants. You know, well, it worked before on some other project, we'll use it on this. So they designed that engine like that. And that was before the days of this CFD work that we had developed. And so NASA said, well, you know, that engine works fine. We've had several successful launches, but it's very inefficient. So we want you to use this CFD capability that you have and analyze the flow inside that engine from the turbo pumps through the injector and out the back end. And we said, okay, man, that's great. You know, we're glad to have the work. So we did it, and it turns out that to carry the hot gas from the hot gas generator across to the injector for those engines, they used 3 big tubes. They were about 6 or 8 inches in diameter. I don't remember the exact size, but they were good sized. And then they had 1 center tube. So they had 3 tubes carrying that hot gas flow over there. Well, what happened was, using our analysis, we found out that they only needed 2 tubes because that center tube was not carrying anything. In fact, it was reverse flowing back the wrong way. And NASA says, oh my gosh, this is crazy. We got all this extra weight in there for those tubes, and we don't need them. So they redesigned that engine based on our analysis. And they came up with just 2 tubes on the outside, and it's worked fine ever since. They haven't lost an engine because of any kind of engine failure. They've lost them for other reasons. So anyway, I was very proud to be a part of that. And it always gave me a thrill when I watched the Saturn, or the shuttle lift off, because I knew that engine was going to work, because we had analyzed it and we knew exactly what it was going to do based on our extensive analysis. And another thing that I was involved in, which be of interest to you maybe, is stealth fighter technology, or stealth airplanes, actually. Lockheed had a contract for the fighter. And as you know, try to protect the airplanes that you're flying over enemy territory by reducing what's called the signature. If your airplane's up here in the air and you're looking at it with a sensor or radar or whatever, you don't want to be able to see it. So first of all, the mechanical engineers, they designed it to have flat surfaces so that instead of reflecting the radar back to the radar station, it would just bounce off into outer space someplace and they couldn't see it. And the other problem had to do with the engine itself. We had an extensive capability in analyzing these exhaust flows for the rockets, and so we put that to work, analyzing the exhaust flow coming out of that airplane to minimize the temperature in the gases so it can't be seen. That's the other signature. You can look up there and see, okay, the sky has a certain image on your instrument. And if there's a blip in there, then that's the engine, the heat from the engine that you see. So we wanted to try to get that exhaust temperature down as much as we could. So we used our CFD analysis and decided, well, first of all, let's put the engine up on top of the wing instead of underneath, so the exhaust flow has to flow over the back of the wing and then mix in with the cold atmospheric air, and it would reduce the temperature. And again, that was a pretty significant thing because we've never had one shot down by a surface-to-air missile. They can't see it, and they can't predict where it's going to be or anything, so they usually missed. Now, this CFD analysis was quite important to the group that I worked with. At one time, I had, I think I peaked out at 15 CFD analysts who had PhDs working on this. So they knew what they were doing. I had, the best one that I had was a little Chinese fellow from Taiwan. He was the smartest man I've ever worked with. And I could describe a problem to him that I wanted him to tackle, and he said, awesome, yeah, I can do that. And he'd run off and he'd run his analysis, and come back with an answer. It was just amazing. But I had a good time doing that. That was a lot of fun. And then I mentioned that I'd written quite a number of scientific articles and presented papers at different scientific meetings around the country. And in fact, if any of you want to do it, you can Google my name on your computers, Alan W. Ratliff, and the first thing that pops up is a bunch of these articles that I wrote. So it might be interesting for you to do that if anybody's interested. Only one cautionary point here. One time I did that, and up popped an Alan W. Ratliff who lived in Florida, and it was his arrest record. So I assure you that was not me. Okay. Well, anyway, we went on to some, as you might think of it, as bigger and better things when a couple of fellows named Towns and Scalo, a couple of research scientists, discovered the laser principle. And one of the principles that he came up with was to generate a really high temperature environment in a certain type of gas like hydrogen or deuterium, something like that. And those molecules would become really highly excited, and if you pass them between a couple of mirrors and set up a cavity between those mirrors, then you would create a lasing action. Optically, it would create lasers. And so I went to a meeting in Albuquerque, New Mexico, at the Air Force Weapons Laboratory, who had initiated all this laser research. And the colonel who was in charge there, he took me in his office, and he had a ceramic brick sitting on his desk, and just sitting there like that, and it had a smooth hole right through it, and where the glass had melted and run down the sides. And he said that was hit with a chemical laser, but we don't know how to do it analytically. Can you do that analytically? And I said, sure. I was a little brazen when I said sure, because we hadn't done it, but we knew enough about rocket engines, and that's a high temperature environment, 6,000 degree gas, and we knew enough about the chemistry and all that went on in there, and we felt like we could couple in the optics associated with the laser cavity, and then we could generate the power that would come out of that lasing process. So we worked on that for about a year and came up with it. And again, I wrote a paper on that, and I think that appears in that under my name in that Google operation, if any of you care to do it. So anyway, that was quite a significant breakthrough, to be able to calculate what they were seeing experimentally with what we did analytically, and you could see the correlation between what power they were observing and what we were calculating, which made us feel really good. We said, great, we were able to do it. Well, anyway, I don't want to keep all of you sitting here listening to more of this. I could tell you many, many stories about things that I was involved with and that I did. I know a lot of you want to get home and watch some football on TV tonight, so I'm going to cut it off a little bit. But I do want to say one other thing. There's always been a song that I associated with my career a little bit. Frank Sinatra sang a song years ago. Had to be years ago because he's been dead and gone for a long time. But anyway, it's a song called My Way. Many of you have heard it. Well, don't worry, I'm not going to sing it, okay? Because you probably would all run out. But anyway, one of the verses goes something like this. It's, if I can remember it correctly, he says something like, regrets, I've had a few, but then again, too few to mention. I did what I had to do and saw it through without exemption. Planned each charted course and each careful step along the byway. And then he goes on to rhyme it with my way. Well, thinking about that, I've had a few regrets. I regret having to leave Ohio, my home state, in order to pursue this career. But I'm glad I did, and I saw it through, and I did what I had to do. I had to make a living for my family, and I did that. And I planned each careful step, like these steps through this analysis, to get more work in for my company. They promoted me for doing that, so that all worked out very good. So anyway, that's about all I wanted to say, but again, thank you, Martha, for corresponding with me and setting this up, and I appreciate the opportunity to say a few words to you and give a few kudos to good old Pataskala High School for launching me on this very successful career. So, that's it.